is making mistakes to have. And now I can turn to the most enjoyable part of the evening, which is, well, actually the most important part will be after I finish introducing Joan Waugh. But she is a professor in the Department of History. She's the author of several books. Mainly, her main academic interests are the history of the second half of the 19th century, with particular emphasis on the Civil War, the Reconstruction period, and the Gilded Age. She had, I think, made a particular mark in the way people look at these events and some of the people retrospectively. She's the author of an extremely well-received book on U.S. Grant and how he has been perceived historically. There's a long list of things that I could read if I hadn't forgotten to bring her bio, but it's just, well, I'm just going to say one other thing about her, which I'd rather say anyway, and that is one of the difficulties at a university, any university, including UCLA, is how do you evaluate teaching? Teaching is a very difficult thing to evaluate, and there are various ways in which we do it, and all of them are flawed. But I happen to know that Joan Waugh is an unusually good teacher, and the reason is I have taught seminars that have included fairly intensive readings by Abraham Lincoln, and I've had a number of students in my seminars who have previously taken Joan Waugh's courses on the Civil War or related matters, and I have been impressed, I'd even say dazzled, by how much those students know about what she has taught them, how much they remember, and how much they understand. And I honestly believe that there is no better way to evaluate a teacher than to see the results in the students sometime after the fact. So ever since I've had that experience, I've been a particular admirer of Joan Waugh, and therefore it is my very great pleasure to introduce her to you.
What would happen if I told you we need to change rooms again? Thank you, Dan, for that very nice introduction, and thank you, too, for all the good work you do as director for the Center of Liberal Arts and Free Institutions, CLAFI, as it's known. And I like your staff, including Will Bowles and Rusty Kilbaner and Julian Fisher and everybody. They've really helped me, a nod of appreciation to them. It means a lot to me that I am here at UCLA giving this talk tonight on the 150th anniversary. I must also thank so many of you in the audience. Some of my colleagues are here, my former colleagues, students, current students, and friends for attending the talk this evening. And those of you that I don't know, I also thank you for coming out tonight. The title of this talk, When the Legend Becomes Fact, Print the Legend, is taken from the famous line in the John Ford movie. John Ford, for those of you who aren't old enough to know about John Ford, he's a Hollywood director, the man who shot Liberty Valance. I actually don't even know why I chose this line exactly, but it seemed to me that people are more often comfortable with legends or myths than with hard and harsh facts. I actually wanted to use a line from U.S. Grant on this, in which he said, "Wars produce many stories of fiction, some of which are told until they are believed to be true." But that would require a much longer title, so I like this. This lecture, as Dan said and I mentioned, is on the 150th anniversary of the surrender that occurred in Appomattox Courthouse in Southwest Virginia on April 9th, 1865. Over the generations, Appomattox became a sacred symbol of a peaceful reunion after a long and bloody civil war. To some extent, I will argue in my paper or my lecture tonight, the myth reflects reality. But the part of the myth that suggests that the surrender of Robert E. Lee to U.S. Grant wrapped up the war in a tidy little bow so that the country could move on seamlessly to its superpower status in the 20th century is false. It's too easy to think that. And we need, as a country, I think, to be reminded that the transition from waging war to waging peace was not easy or bloodless or smooth in the era after the Civil War. We need to continue to appreciate the legend, but bring the facts back and print the history too. I only knew what was in my mind, and this is a picture of a very famous painting by Louis Guillaume of the surrender at Appomattox, Grant and Lee. And I will show visuals throughout the talk, as my students know is my custom. I only knew what was in my mind, General Ulysses, as Grant said, describing his feelings as he sat down to write out the terms of surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, that fateful day in April 1865. Somehow that sentence makes it all so simple. It was not. That day that you see portrayed here was surely the height of Ulysses S. Grant's military career, cementing his reputation as a magnanimous warrior, as well as foreshadowing his post-war role, including his 2 terms as president. I think you could say about him that he was one of the major figures of the 19th century, a famous Union general from 1862 to 1865, involved in the transition, the post-war transition with President Andrew Johnson, and then serving as president for 2 terms. Twice before Appomattox, Grant accepted the surrender of a major Confederate force, one at Fort Donelson, the first at Fort Donelson, Tennessee in 1862, and at Vicksburg, Mississippi in 1863. In those 2 campaigns, Grant was relentless in pursuing victory, but once secured, he also displayed magnanimity, anticipating the more celebrated generosity of the 1865 surrender. This generosity reflected his and President Abraham Lincoln's desire for an easy reunion with the Confederacy, while insisting that the people of the rebellious states swear a loyalty oath to the United States and accept emancipation. My talk tonight will examine briefly the elements of the first 2 of Grant's surrenders. I also want to touch base with a few of the political concerns that swirled around Grant and Lincoln and Secretary of War Stanton as the war came to its close in 1864 and 1865. And then I turned to the story of Appomattox Courthouse. So by the end, we in this room can place Grant's statement, "I only knew what was in my mind," in a richer, perhaps more compelling perspective. A word about surrender. This is General U.S. Grant, the end of the Civil War. A word about surrender, which is what I'm going to be talking about tonight. We all know pretty much what surrender is. And when I looked it up in the OED, I found, like many English words, it has many definitions. In the context of the Civil War, a military or political surrender is defined as giving up something valuable, a fortress, an army, a defined territory, a country, a set of demands to an enemy. Thus, at Appomattox, Grant was already well aware of the complications of negotiating surrenders, both as a process, but also something else, as a ceremony, replete with symbolism that carried much important implications for the future. As the only Civil War general to accept the surrender of 3 entire armies it is worth reviewing the elements of the first two to see if there's anything to be learned about the third. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go through the first one, Fort Donelson, and then Vicksburg, and then move on from there. But I think you will learn some things about this. This is a depiction of the surrender at Fort Donelson. And this happened early in the war. In February 1862, Union strategy in the Western Theater. The Western Theater isn't often as often written about or is of great interest to many Americans when they study the Civil War as the Eastern Theater. The Eastern Theater featuring the great battles in Virginia and Pennsylvania and some other places, Maryland as well. But the Western Theater in Tennessee and Mississippi and Georgia was one of great importance, for example, to the two presidents, Jefferson Davis and Abraham Lincoln. They knew that whoever controlled the Mississippi River would be in a good position to win the war. And Union strategy in the early part of the war in 1862 in February targeted a very important and strongly defended Fort Donelson in Tennessee, on the Tennessee state side of the Cumberland River, if you know your rivers in this country. And they clashed there, the Union and the Confederates. Sharp fighting gave the rebels expectation of winning that battle, but disagreement between the Fort Donelson was controlled by the Confederates, and disagreement between the fort's two senior Confederate commanders led them to abandoning the scene of carnage and destruction. And they left in the wake a lesser-ranked officer, a man named Simon Buckner. He was a brigadier general then. He was in charge. And as federal forces pressed their advantage, the overwhelmed Buckner sent the commanding officer of the infantry forces at Fort Donelson in Tennessee a letter. And this was typical. He sent him a letter asking the Union commander to declare an armistice. That means stop the fighting. And following that, he proposed holding a conference in which the two men, Grant and Buckner, would appoint representatives to discuss terms for Donelson's surrender. The result is famous. Ulysses S. Grant's swift and terse reply, quote, "No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works," electrified a northern public hungry for just one victory, but was condemned by Buckner as, quote, "ungenerous and unchivalrous," unquote. Buckner, whom Grant had known before the war, they were all at West Point together, they were in the Mexican War together, they were colleagues before the war, and now they weren't. But Buckner really had no choice but to accept. What made the military surrender at Donelson unconditional? An unconditional surrender, and this is a hard one, you might want to take notes, is a surrender without conditions. You think you know everything, don't you? It means that no guarantees are given to a losing army. When Grant refused Buckner's initial request for a meeting to discuss terms, instead proposing to move immediately upon your works, the surrender became unconditional. Riding to Buckner's headquarters through lines of Confederate soldiers, Grant and his staff dismounted at the Dover Hotel, which you see in back of me. It was a two-story wood building, as it is now, situated on the riverfront. There, after some preliminary pleasantries, and the record of this meeting is interesting between Grant and Buckner. They told jokes, they exchanged memories shared by them. They got down to business, or Grant got down to business and worked out the details. Notably, Grant decided to completely dispense with any notion of a formal surrender. He didn't have to do that. Formal surrender ceremonies were common. And he said, nope, not going to do it. We don't need a formal surrender of the Confederate garrison of approximately 15,000 soldiers. And by the way, 15,000 soldiers surrendered at Fort Donelson in February of 1862. That was the size of the U.S. Army before the Civil War. It was the largest surrender in United States history up until that time. In any case, Grant believed that this formality, this ceremony that would feature the lowering of the flag and Buckner handing over his ceremonial sword, served no purpose but to humiliate. And here's what he said. Here's how he explained it. "The surrender is now a fact," Grant said. "We have the fort, we have the men, the guns. Why should we go through vain forms and mortify and injure the spirit of brave men who, after all, are our own countrymen?" Grant's last few words are worth a second hearing here. Our own countrymen reflected his belief, shared by, it must be said, a majority of Northerners, that Southerners were engaged in a rebellion, not a war between nations. Once the rebellion had ended, and of course, this early in the war, both sides hoped that their causes would prevail, that it would end without too much more damage or death. Once it ended, if the United States won, the rebel states would be returned to their proper relationship within the country. The Northern commander at this time promoted an ideal of victorious restraint toward the defeated foe. In February of 1862, it was still a limited war that held out the distinct possibility that the two sections could be reconciled with, quote, the famous phrase, "the Union as it was." And that means with slavery intact. And that is why the Emancipation Proclamation was not issued yet in February 1862. And as possibly you know, the Civil War is the worst kind of war a country can be embroiled in. And the shorter it is, the better the hope for a reconciliation with a minimum of bitterness and destruction. And the scenes that unfolded around Fort Donelson seemed to validate a hopeful expectation like that. Not only were the officers who served together in the old Army before the Civil War engaging on friendly terms, but numerous Union and Confederate soldiers could be seen milling about, chatting with each other, exchanging trinkets and newspapers, sort of finding out the news from each side. Grant ordered his soldiers not to act disrespectfully toward the Confederate captives who would be on their way to northern prison camps. I am sure there were many times when his orders were breached, but the fact that he did issue official orders, I think, is important. The meeting at the Dover Hotel hammered out the details of the surrender, including arrangements for the treatment of injured soldiers and the transport of men who were taken north to prisoner. These men, these 15,000 Confederate soldiers, went to newly opened prison camps in Ohio, in Illinois, and in Massachusetts. Buckner prepared himself and some of his troops to leave for those prison camps on a special steamer. And just before they departed, he asked Grant to witness something. Grant stood quietly by while General Buckner, the Confederate commander that was left at Fort Donelson, spoke to his men, praising his kindness and respect that he showed to the Confederate soldiers. The consequences of the fall of Fort Donelson were profoundly important in determining the course of the war. Unconditional surrender Grant, as he was known, not Ulysses S. anymore, now unconditional surrender Grant. His demand for that unconditional surrender removed from the fighting theater an army, 16,000 men. That was huge. And it made him the first great military hero for the North of the Civil War. We have to remember that in the Eastern Theater, where we're all focused on, there was nothing but defeat, beginning with Fort Sumter, going through Bull Run, and other smaller battles that were in the Eastern Theater. So he was the great military hero of the Union. It also, as victories tended to do during the Civil War, raised hopes for an end to the conflict, with the victory going to the United States. In this Western theater that I've been talking about, The rebel line of defense had been demolished. Kentucky and Middle Tennessee was secured for the Union, leading to the fall of Nashville, the state capital, and then the capture of Memphis. Later in the summer or the spring, New Orleans and Louisiana fell. As the Union forces moved to secure their control of Confederate territory, they disrupted railroad lines, destroyed property, liberated slaves, and in this way, we can see that the consequences gives us the preview of perhaps the difficulty of bringing the United States back together again and Reconstruction, in which the North had to win the all-out war. The Confederacy only had to stay in the war day by day by day, have their government operating and their armies fighting the North. But the North had to find the will to not only defeat the Confederate forces in battles, but also figure out a way to occupy this country that they always thought was their own anyway, occupy and crush the resistance. So that was a part of the top military command in the East and West. That's what they had to do. Figure out how to bring disaffected citizens in Memphis back through loyalty oaths, but also figure out policies toward the contrabands and what was to be done by them, for them. Union setbacks. I mean, if Fort Donelson was the greatest victory, and people hoped that there would be victories in the Eastern Theater in 1862 in the summer and fall to pair with that and bring the war to an end, they were disappointed. Union setbacks in that theater, the rise of Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia, defeating Lincoln's great army, the Army of the Potomac, in time and time again, together with the introduction of emancipation added to the Union cause after the Battle of Antietam, changed the administration's national strategy, which was conditional surrender. In other words, the political strategy changed from one that might reunite the states with the Union as it was with slavery to unconditional surrender with the destruction of the social structure and economy upon which the South had been based. In other words, all that is by way of saying the hope for a quick and easy victory faded. And it certainly had faded by the time of Grant's second surrender agreement signed at Vicksburg, Mississippi on July 4th, 1863. A great book about Grant and the Union Army during this time in the West is entitled Grant Moves South. And that's what he kept doing, moving south. And the federal goal from the beginning of the war of securing the length of the Mississippi River, taking it out of the control of the Confederates, was accomplished by U.S. Grant's masterful campaign in 1862 and 1863 to capture Vicksburg, Mississippi, which controlled 250 miles of the Mississippi River. This heavily fortified city contained within its border a sizable Confederate army commanded by someone else Grant knew from the Mexican War, Lieutenant General John C. Pemberton. In the late spring and early summer of 1863, Grant combined both naval and infantry forces to encircle and to capture Vicksburg. After a series of smashing victories, Grant's forces besieged Vicksburg for 47 days from late May through the month of June. By July 1st, Pemberton realized that he had to capitulate, and he sent out a letter under a white flag of truce. White flags of truce, that was another accepted sign that surrender was imminent, reaching Grant on the morning of July 3rd, 1863. Like Buckner, General Pemberton requested a meeting to discuss terms. "I make the proposition," Pemberton said, "to save the further effusion of blood, which must otherwise be shed to a frightful extent, feeling myself fully able to maintain my position for a yet indefinite period. Pemberton's bluff was swatted away by Grant, who stated, "The useless effusion of blood you propose stopping by this course can be ended at any time you may choose by an unconditional surrender of the city and the garrison." Hey, it worked before. "I have no terms other than those indicated above." But he softened his harsh tone in this letter to Pemberton. Grant added, "Men who have shown such endurance and courage as those now in Vicksburg will always challenge the respect of an adversary, and I can assure you will be treated with all the respect due to prisoners of war." Despite his use of unconditional surrender, here's an interesting feature of the surrender at Vicksburg, and this is Grant and Pemberton meeting on the battlefield. Grant agreed to a meeting with Pemberton at 3 p.m. in the afternoon of July 3rd. Pemberton arrived dressed in full uniform, meeting Grant in his usual field dress, that's a casual dress, between the lines of the two armies. Thousands of soldiers were watching them. You could drop a pin. They were so intent. They so hoped that this would end. They didn't, however, have a successful exchange of opinion. Grant repeated his terms of unconditional surrender. However, the fact that he met with Pemberton already ruined the unconditional surrender thing. But they broke up, and yet they both decided to appoint representatives to try and work something out. At this point, the relative ease which the Donelson surrender was dispatched must have seemed very distant to Grant. Sitting in the Mississippi summer heat 17 months later, you can imagine what that was like. The stakes of surrender were even higher, as both men knew well that the loss of Vicksburg and the loss of control of the Mississippi River would be a catastrophe for the South. No agreement was reached by the end of that afternoon, and Grant promised Pemberton before he left their situation on the field that he'd have something for him to chew over by the end of the night. One of the only times, or at least Grant said it was the only time that he consulted, that he had a meeting with his corps and division commanders to talk to them about what to do. After getting their advice, Grant decided to reframe his surrender from unconditional to conditional. His letter to Pemberton, delivered that night, offered parole instead of incarceration. And it was sent to Pemberton a few hours later. Pemberton accepted. The official surrender would take place on the morning of the 4th of July, 1863. Why did Grant change his mind? He didn't want to launch another assault. He didn't want one more soldier on either side to die in the taking of Vicksburg. And he also didn't want to send thousands, 30,000 Confederates to northern prison camps, which were already overfull. And he also didn't want to detach the units from his army needed to travel with those prisoners. And here's what he said himself: "Had I insisted upon an unconditional surrender, there would have been over 30,000 men to transport to Cairo, Illinois, very much to the inconvenience of the Army of the Mississippi. So instead, the whole Confederate garrison was paroled." What did that mean? It meant that the prisoners could go free if they promised not to re-enter the war until exchanged for Union prisoners. Beginning at 8 a.m. on July 4th, and this is a picture of, I'm not sure why that arrow is there, but maybe it's pointing to the stars and stripes flying over the Vicksburg courthouse. And the surrender was conducted, the flag was raised, but it was very restrained. Even though it was Independence Day, it was a very happy day for the Army. Grant ordered rations to be distributed to the hungry Southern soldiers and townspeople. Grant remembered a happy scene. He described the day of the surrender as one in which the men of the two armies fraternized as if they had been fighting for the same cause. I think that was I don't even know why he said that, because everything I've read about it is that this was a very bitter on both sides. It reflected the hard part of the Middle War. There, the negotiations that he had with Pemberton, and that a couple days later were very unfriendly, and he also began to hear criticism for his decision to parole the men, the 30,000 men of the Confederate Army from people in the United States, from newspapers. Was he worried about it? He wasn't. He dismissed it. He claimed that many, if not the majority of prisoners, wished to avoid war altogether, and that their possible escape was, quote, precisely what I expected and hoped that they would do. Although many did return to the battlefield, a sizable number did not. And in my research, I'm writing a book on surrender during the Civil War, and in my research I find that Jefferson Davis, it broke his heart, the president of the Confederate States of America, a man who had a plantation just below Vicksburg, it broke his heart that the Vicksburg was given up, and he sent some very angry letters to Pemberton and the other general who was in charge of this, Johnston, and he said, well, are we going to get these men back? Are we going to get these men back? Well, the fact is most of them never came back. They took advantage of the parole and they disappeared into the countryside. But Grant said this. He said, I knew many of them were tired of the war and would get home just as soon as they could. He said the men had behaved so well, meaning the Confederates, that I did not want to humiliate them. I believe that consideration for their feelings would make them less dangerous foes during the continuance of the hostilities and better citizens after the war was over. At both Fort Donelson and Vicksburg, Grant combined devastating military victories with sensible and even sensitive surrender policy, pointing toward reunion of the two warring countries. His actions suggested that winning the peace would be as meaningful as winning the war. Vicksburg's capture accomplished three important goals. It secured Union control of the Mississippi River, split the Confederacy in half from its eastern and its western sides, and delivered a devastating blow to Southern morale. The two great victories in the summer of 1863 at Vicksburg and someplace called Gettysburg bolstered Northern hopes for peace. But still, that peace seemed frustratingly distant, as emancipation policy and the enrollment of black soldiers into the Union Army, which took place under Grant's control and support, added to the complications of any possible reunion. It was getting more complicated by the minute. Acting quickly after Vicksburg and another Grant victory at Chattanooga, Tennessee, President Lincoln brought the Eastern man, the Western man east. In fact, he brought a lot of Western men east because he was so unhappy with his generals in the Eastern Theater, particularly those that commanded the Army of the Potomac, the biggest Union Army in the at this point in the United States. On March 9, 1864, the newly appointed Lieutenant General Grant accepted command of all the Union armies, cementing his growing reputation as a symbol of Union military victory. Grant and Lincoln, who had never met until Grant came to Washington, D.C., would come to enjoy an unusually close relationship. This is a painting that hangs in the National Gallery. It's a beautiful, sort of bold, militaristic painting showing Grant riding into the country with his generals, never of whom ever were in one place at one time, but that doesn't matter, right? It's the myth that matters. Lincoln, over the course of the war, developed skills in military strategy that guided his ultimate national strategy of saving the Union. Grant developed the political skills that complemented his military abilities with the same ultimate goal in mind. save the Union, save the Union, save the Union. Ulysses S. Grant became the premier soldier statesman, we can call him, of the conflict. Grant accepted, unlike many other of Lincoln's generals, accepted without question the president's ultimate power as commander-in-chief. As one author wrote, quote, Grant and Lincoln reassured each other of good intentions by maintaining separate spheres of authority. This is a slide of a very popular sculpture. It's called the Council of War. And I want to call your attention to it because it reflects the closeness of these three men as the war came to a close. This is Ulysses S. Grant, this is Abraham Lincoln, this is Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War. In one way or the other, they were all in constant contact with each other. They would, Lincoln and Grant, and Lincoln certainly Stanton and Grant would not always agree, and more than a few times in the next year from 1864 to 1865, Lincoln expressed frustration with the Union Army's lack of military success under Grant's strategy operating in Virginia and Georgia. And certainly there's no more dramatic and exciting year in the Civil War than the great clash between Ulysses S. Grant and the Army of the Potomac against Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia as they fought it out over the countryside of Virginia. Lincoln traveled twice to Grant's headquarters in City Point, Virginia during this time, especially during the summer of 1864, to discuss these frustrations. He needed to win the war. He needed a victory to ensure his re-election and save the Union. But as Lincoln reminded Secretary of War Edwin Stanton on one such occasion of disappointment, he said, "You and I, Mr. Stanton, have been trying to boss this job, and we have not succeeded very well with it. We have sent across the mountains for Mr. Grant to relieve us, and I think we'd better leave him alone to do as he pleases." And for the most part they did, and Union triumphs finally secured on all fronts made possible Lincoln's re-election on November 8, 1864. As fall passed into winter, Union victory appeared more and more likely as Grant pressed rebel forces on all fronts. While Grant was working for total victory, he was also alert to the possibilities of ending the war through a negotiated peace. That would be good, bringing him to an even closer working relationship with the president. This relationship was of some concern to Lincoln and Stanton. What they didn't want was Grant to make a surrender that would have political repercussions for Reconstruction. And that was a possibility, certainly was a possibility with Lincoln's other generals. Both were very worried that a military surrender, both Lincoln and Stanton, handled wrongly might usurp the president's control. Lincoln desired a hard war and a soft peace. General Grant was to deliver the former, while the president would deliver the latter. As late 1864 passed into 1865, Union victory seemed increasingly imminent despite the Confederate leadership's refusal to give up. Under Grant's direction, the work of crushing Southern morale, destroying the country's capability to sustain itself, and defeating various armies was rapidly bringing the rebellion to its knees. By late February 1865, Grant remarked on the many signs, quote, of dissolution that were appearing, including a wave of desertion hitting Lee's army. Doubtless, he was thinking constantly about the possibility of an impending surrender and the terms he would dictate. On March 20th, 1865, General Grant invited President Lincoln to visit him at his headquarters in Virginia, City Point, for a few days. And they went to a meeting. They met on Lincoln's boat called the River Queen. And he met with, this is Lincoln, of course, I know you recognize him. This is David Dixon Porter, the naval commander who worked with Grant so well at the Vicksburg campaign. This is Ulysses S. Grant. And the fellow pointing his finger and talking is William Tecumseh Sherman, who liked to take control of things. I'm not sure that's a realistic portrait either. But according to all the men who were there, Lincoln discussed at length and in some depth what the terms of a military surrender should entail, as well as articulating his own ideas about Reconstruction. Although a lot of the details of the meeting remain closed, Sherman and Porter's later accounts stressed again and again that Lincoln kept telling them, give generous terms. I want generous terms, so quote, they won't take up arms again. But historians have assumed, and I believe this would be quite reasonable, that Lincoln, while expressing his desire for a harmonious reunion, also insisted that two demands be made of the soon-to-be former Confederates. They swear a loyalty oath to the United States, and they accept emancipation. Together, those demands represented what we can call an unconditional surrender, the national strategy of the Confederacy to the United States. And that is why all the peace negotiations that were flying about at this time, if you saw the movie Lincoln, you know about Hampton Roads, there were others, they all came to nothing because Jefferson Davis refused to accept anything but Confederate independence, and Abraham Lincoln refused to accept anything except bringing the country back together and them accepting emancipation. Well, the bottom line was this: momentous decisions had to be made, and soon, but so much was going to be determined by circumstances. Lincoln played his Reconstruction cards close to the vest because he did not want to be pinned down by a rigidly defined position, which actually explains most of his policies throughout the war, because he was aware of the divisions in his own party, pushing this way or that way for a harsh or an easy Reconstruction, and the United States as a whole on this issue. Everyone had a different idea. Lincoln and Stanton continued to make clear to Grant that his job was not to negotiate the conditions of peace. What Grant could do was to negotiate the surrender of Lee's army. Whenever and wherever that surrender was to take place, sight unknown, it was going to be the surrender of one army to another. Lincoln said this to Grant, quote, I will deal with the political questions and negotiate for peace. Your job is to fight. After the fall of Petersburg and the capital Richmond in Virginia, the Appomattox campaign began. On March 25th, 1865, approximately almost 80,000 Union soldiers pursued 60,000 Confederate. It ended with 60,000 United States soldiers and 30,000 Confederate soldiers. These numbers are very controversial. You read some history books and Lee only had 3 soldiers left. This wasn't true, actually. A lot of them were leaving his army, but there were 30,000 counted in the patrols in Appomattox. In any case, the Appomattox campaign began. I don't know if you can see this map very well, but here you have the fall of Richmond, and then you had the movement of the Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee, what he hoped to do after the fall of Richmond, it was clear that he would have to leave Virginia, and if he could just break through the Union encirclement that was coming toward him, he could meet up with Joe Johnston's army in North Carolina. And what he was hoping to do is to make one last stand to turn around and face Grant's army. Whether that would have worked, I don't know. But the Union's destruction of the rebels' last supply line on April 1st sort of set things in motion. By April 6th, a further disaster was inflicted on Sailor's Creek. In other words, the cavalry and infantry were now cutting off Lee's remaining escape routes one by one. On the evening of April 7th, 1865, Grant consulted with his commanders regarding what all agreed was a desperate situation for the Confederates. Grant remarked this. He said, "I have a great mind to summon Lee to surrender." And he sat down and wrote a note to Robert E. Lee. He said, "The result of the last week must convince you of the hopelessness of further resistance on the part of the Army of Northern Virginia in this struggle. I feel that it is so and regard it as my duty to shift from myself the responsibility of any further effusion of blood by asking of you the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia." Lee replied asking Grant to outline his proposed surrender and received from the Union commander this note on April 8th, quote, "I would say that peace being my great desire, there is but one condition I would insist on, namely that the men and officers surrendered shall be disqualified for taking up arms again against the government of the United States until properly exchanged." Lee responded to Grant's note. He said, "I'm not ready to surrender yet, just kidding." But what he did was to suggest a meeting to discuss possible peace negotiations. Grant's response immediately sat down and wrote the note saying that he could not discuss peace terms, but only accept a surrender. Lee had a meeting with his commanders, and he was holding meetings all during this time, taking advice, and many of his commanders started off by saying, an advisor said, hold on, we can break through. But finally, it was clear that there was no hope at all. And Lee turned his face when told of that sentiment, and he said, "Then there is nothing left me but to go see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." Making this dramatic moment in history more so. Remember, this is a war. At this time, almost 750,000 soldiers had died. It seemed like the 4 years would never end. And making this dramatic moment in history more so, in the last hours of the conflict, Grant's physical condition was precarious. A great anxiety. He didn't know what was going to happen and where the end was going to be, like we do. And he couldn't eat. He had chronic sleeplessness and pure exhaustion. Students, it sounds like your life. Brought on a debilitating migraine headache. Despite his condition, on the morning of April 9th, Grant and his staff rode down the road toward this little tiny crossroads town called Appomattox Courthouse, intending on joining one of his top commanders, General Philip Sheridan. At 11 a.m., they stopped to rest, and Grant's headache was still raging. While so resting, an aide rode toward them at a very fast clip. In his hand was a sealed envelope containing Lee's reply to Grant's most recent communique, sent off early that morning. The general opened the envelope, read the message without commenting. He handed it to his aide, a guy named John Rawlins, and asked him to read it out loud. Quote, "General," Lee wrote, "I therefore request an interview at such time and place as you may designate to discuss the terms of the surrender of this army in accordance with your offer to have such an interview contained in your letter of yesterday." The headache disappeared. A little after 1:30 p.m., Grant and his staff rode into the tiny village of Appomattox Courthouse, where they were directed to a 2-story brick farmhouse belonging to one Wilmer McLean. I can tell that some of you know that story. He was there to welcome them, of course. Lee was waiting for him in the residence. Grant dismounted his beautiful dark horse named Cincinnati and climbed the 7 steps into the house. In the parlor to the left sat Robert E. Lee and his aide, Colonel Charles Marshall. Grant and Lee shook hands. And this is another depiction of the surrender. Lee returned to his chair in the parlor of the McLean House in Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. His chair was next to an oval-shaped table near the front window. Grant drew up a leather-back chair and also sat down, placing his gloves and hat on a nearby marble-top table, about 10 feet from Lee. Outside, thousands and thousands of weary soldiers watched and waited. That's all they could do. All in the room were well aware of the extraordinary contrast between the two commanders. General Lee, aristocratic looking. General Grant, well, just one ordinary looking fellow. General Lee, attired in his best uniform, with his fancy sword by his side, he had dressed carefully for the occasion. The commanding general of the Northern armies did not. The wagon with his dress uniform and equipment had disappeared. Was he going to go out looking for it? No. Instead, he wore his preferred casual field uniform with Lieutenant General's shoulder straps pinned on them. In addition, his attire was complete with mud splatters from the journey that day. But far from insulting Lee or diminishing the importance of the occasion, Grant's informal manner revealed and embodied much about the man, just as Lee's did. As a sign of respect, he explained his appearance to Lee later. He said, "I had not expected so soon the result that was then taking place, and consequently was in rough garb." The two commanders engaged in an awkward exchange about their service in the Mexican War, with Lee bringing the conversation up short by asking for the terms of surrender. "What would they be?" he asked. Grant responded that the terms were exactly the same as earlier indicated in his letter of April 8th. Quote, "The men and officers who surrendered were to be paroled and could not take arms up again until exchanged properly. The arms and supplies were to be turned over as captured property. This is a military surrender." Grant observed his counterpart's face during this conversation, remembering that, quote, "What General Lee's feelings were, I do not know. As he was a man of much dignity, with an impassive face, it was impossible to say whether he felt inwardly glad that the end had finally come." For his part, Lee appeared satisfied with Grant's description of his terms, and perhaps he was very relieved that the dreaded phrase, unconditional surrender, was not uttered. Lee asked Grant to write out the terms of the surrender. Grant agreed and waited while his military secretary, Eli Parker, a full-blooded Seneca Indian, who was brought over a small table and his manifold order book, and that was a tablet prepared with carbon paper to make 3 copies. Puffing on a cigar, Grant prepared to write, quote, "When I put my pen to paper," he recalled at this moment, "I did not know the first word that I should make use of in writing the terms. I only knew what was in my mind, and I wished to express it clearly so that there could be no mistaking it." And there was no mistaking it. Acutely aware of Lincoln's desire for leniency, which was his too, Grant rejected any fancy words for a straightforward, simple explanation of the process by which the officers and the men of the Army of Northern Virginia would stack their arms and record their paroles. "As I wrote on," Grant explained, "the thought occurred to me that the officers had their own private horses and effects, which were important to them, but of no value to us. It would be an unnecessary humiliation to call upon them to deliver their sidearms. So then these items were to be excluded from the weapons and property to be turned over to the federal forces. Also excluded would be a request for Lee's ceremonial sword as a trophy of war. In the meeting, Grant did not ask for, nor did Lee offer, his sword. No need to inflict that humiliation." And then there was the final part of Grant's letter to Lee. The famous last sentence, which Civil War historian Bruce Catton described as, quote, "one of the greatest sentences in American history." I'm still waiting for someone to say that about something that I wrote. It's as follows: "Each officer and man will be allowed to return to their homes, not to be disturbed by United States authority, so long as they observe their parole and the laws in force where they may reside." That sentence guaranteed a secure future for all Confederate soldiers, including the highest military officials such as Robert E. Lee. It was of vital importance in ending the war and shaping the peace to follow. Parker at his side, Grant looked at his handiwork, made a few corrections, and then it was Lee's turn to review the document. When Lee came to the end, he looked up and remarked, "This will have a very happy effect upon my army." Lee had one more request. Would Grant please consider letting the enlisted men keep their animals for spring farming? Grant agreed, prompting Lee to say, "It will be very gratifying and will do much toward conciliating our people." Lee then returned the order book to Grant, who in turn ordered an ink copy be drawn up. Lee wrote out a letter accepting the terms, which also had to be copied. As these documents were being prepared, Grant introduced Lee to the staff officers and generals who had crowded into the small room. And one of them included the son of Abraham Lincoln, Robert Lincoln, who was attached to Grant's staff at this time. The two men discussed prisoners, and Grant agreed to provide food for them. Around 3 p.m., Lee and Grant parted ways. They shook hands, and the ex-Confederate commander left the house and called for his horse, Traveler. When Lee mounted, Grant lifted his hat in salute, as did the other Union officers. Lee did the same and then rode away. The observations of two Confederate soldiers made at this time, they were at the surrender, showed an appreciative response to the terms and the tone of the surrender conducted by Grant. When we learned that we should be paroled, this cannoneer recorded, and go to our homes unmolested, the relief was unbounded. The favorable and entirely unexpected terms of surrender wonderfully restored our souls. Another Confederate remarked, "I am forced to admit that the federal officers and troops conducted themselves with singular propriety throughout this time, and Northern officers came without parade and departed without uncourteous reference to our misfortune." Later, Colonel Marshall, who was Lee's aide at the surrender, described it this way: "There was no theatrical display about it. It was the simplest, plainest, and most thoroughly devoid of any attempt at effect that you can imagine." Another testimonial came from the ex-Confederate General Porter Alexander, who was there that day. Quote, "General Grant's conduct toward us in the whole matter is worthy of the very highest praise and indicates a great and broad and generous mind. For all time, it will be a good thing for the whole United States that of all the federal generals, it fell to Grant to receive the surrender of Lee." Grant left and rode to headquarters. News of the surrender spread quickly through the Union camps. Soon thousands of soldiers were cheering and throwing their hats into the air. We might expect them to do that. 100-gun salute commenced. We might expect that as well. But Grant stopped it, immediately stating, "The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again, and the best sign of rejoicing after the victory will be to abstain from all demonstrations in the field." You can, that didn't happen. They couldn't help themselves. But that is the way he felt, and wherever he went, it was quiet. He also remarked that he felt like anything rather than rejoicing. Almost as an afterthought, Grant sent a telegram to Stanton, tersely informing him, quote, "General Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia this afternoon on terms proposed by myself." Again, as with the aftermath of Donelson and Vicksburg, no sustained celebration, no victory dance was allowed. Although several more armies would still surrender, the meeting between Grant and Lee at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, Palm Sunday, is considered the end of the Civil War. The deeply Christian nation exulted in and commemorated the connection between what they deemed to be two sacred occasions. Palm Sunday, which falls 1 week before Easter, commemorating Christ's triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And this is a Harper's Weekly spread that makes this explicit. It was published in Harper's Weekly, the most widely read journal in the North, a week after Lincoln's assassination. And it invites the reader to see the end of the Civil War and the Union's victory as a work of God, but it also praises reconciliation. After meeting with Lee briefly the next morning, the morning of April 10th, Grant traveled to Washington, D.C., deliberately missing a formal ceremony of the laying down of arms occurring on April 12th. And when U.S. Grant did get to Washington City, Lincoln expressed his unqualified approval of the terms he had given Lee. The North celebrated, although approval of the Appomattox Agreement was not as widespread as is usually portrayed in the history books. His Appomattox Surrender Agreement provoked immediate controversy, and from the perspective of those in the North in April 1865 who were talking of traitors, who were talking of treason trials and hanging, the agreement seemed ridiculously generous. An editorial in the New York Times claimed it was very evident that a large number of our citizens would have been better satisfied if Grant had not allowed Lee and his men their parole, while the New York Tribune editorial board described the terms as regarded with disgust and unqualified indignation by large numbers of the most sensible and loyal and influential citizens in this region. These feelings, however, were checked by Lincoln's steadfast determination to stand behind Grant's peace agreement. Indeed, despite misgivings, the overwhelming evidence suggests that the majority of loyal citizens conflated, combined, and treated the Appomattox peace terms with the securing of Union victory. My conclusion is this, that Grant's terms at Appomattox arose out of his war experience, particularly at Fort Donelson and Vicksburg, and through his conversations and constant communications with Lincoln at City Point and elsewhere. The last part of the simple document represented something that he had given a lot of thought to, expressed in concentrated form. This done, each officer and man will be allowed to return to their homes, not to be disturbed by United States authority, so long as they observe their parole and the laws in force where they may reside. Those words revealed his view that when the war was over, there would be no vindictive policy toward the enemy, revealed his agreement with Lincoln that favored clemency, generosity, love, and mercy, revealed his belief that Reconstruction would not and should not be simply an indulgence in revenge. Grant's Appomattox surrender document then was not a product of a fleeting moment suggested by the statement, "I only knew what was in my mind," but reflected actions committed and policies formulated in the battlefield and conversations held with the highest political authorities throughout the war. Grant's sentiment and judgment joined him firmly with his president's vision of a Reconstruction policy conducted with as little rancor as possible. Here, Grant's final sentence made the military surrender into a peace agreement that would set the stage for true reconciliation, if not in the near future, then sometime within a few generations. In short, Grant's terms offered peace and reconciliation to those who would embrace it. Because the final part, the part that you're seeing on the screen now and that I've quoted at least 2 times, that sentence packed so much punch, some have pointed out that Grant actually did intrude into the political Reconstruction by fleshing out, by defining conditions and consequences of the parole he was offering in these terms to the soldiers of the major Confederate army in the field. And they are right. Exceeding his instructions, Grant made a promise that rightfully belonged to another, but was one that was rendered so perfectly no complaint was lodged by his president. The Union commander who had accepted the cruelties of a hard war, who had waged that hard war without any illusion that victory could be achieved without fighting, who had borne the personal responsibility of bringing immense sacrifice on the part of both soldiers and civilians, also never forgot the ultimate goal of restoring a peaceful Union. Until the day he died, Grant believed that on April 9, 1865, he had produced a surrender document worthy of the sacrifices of his people in the war. After Appomattox, Ulysses S. Grant was a magnanimous warrior. No word was more important than magnanimous in describing the Union general, and no myth more central to understanding the ending of the Civil War and the beginning of Reconstruction and reunion than that of the surrender at Appomattox. Simply put, the surrender reigns as one of the supremely beautiful moments in our national history. After this bloody, brilliant war, two brilliant but stunningly different commanders, one tall and perfectly attired, and one plain, unpretentious figure embodying the common man, met and forged the nation anew. To his great credit, Robert E. Lee maintained a public position urging his men and his former country people to accept their defeat and get on with their lives. Today, in 2015, on the anniversary, bells rang across the nation. We probably didn't hear any in Los Angeles. Bells rang across the nation at 3 p.m. for 4 minutes, 1 minute for each year of the war, at selected schools, historic sites, churches, temples, and selected public buildings. It was orchestrated by the National Park Service, and on their website, this communique appeared. Quote, "Some communities may ring their bells in celebration of freedom or a restored union, others as an expression of mourning and a moment of silence for the fallen." This talk has been about Grant, but it has been equally about the nature of surrender during the American Civil War. Surrender has multiple levels of meanings. As I explained at the beginning of this lecture, in the context of the Civil War, it meant giving something up valuable, a fortress, an army, a territory, a country, to an enemy. But surrender can also mean something beautiful, tender, or forgiving. It can mean surrendering to a lover, or surrendering a soul to God. It can mean a surrender of individual selfishness to a greater good. Surrender's multiple meanings were present in full force in different ways at Donelson, at Vicksburg, and especially at Appomattox. All three places were at once sites of brutal warfare and conflict, sites of reunion, sites of reconciliation, and almost immediately, sites of memory. The scars of this awful war were too deep to heal quickly or easily. Magnanimity in the moment of victory proved easier than a true loving reunion. The challenge of building a new society in the South that included both black and white proved nearly impossible. There would be reconstruction, political and economic accommodation after the Civil War and the decades following the Civil War, but precious little true reconciliation. What there was came out of the Appomattox Surrender Agreement, an act of mercy which secured the United States for all time and within time, maybe just enough reconciliation to keep the spirit of unity alive. The complex nature of surrender during the Civil War, encompassing hatred and love, despair and hope, bitterness and forgiveness, can somehow be summed up in one deceptively simple sentence: I only knew what was in my mind. Thank you.
Before Joan takes a few questions, just a couple of announcements. First, I would just want to thank Joan for a talk that I think was not only wonderfully informative, but also very moving. And I can't resist making this comment. I always say to people, you should come to CLAFI lectures, you'll learn such marvelous things, but I never thought to say to somebody, and you can learn how to cure a headache. All you need is Civil War.
It was easy.
Couple of announcements. First of all, there were some things left, trash on the desks in the other room. We'll take care of that, but please remember, the caterers will take care of the food in the back, but everything else is going to be as you leave it. There will be students coming in for a class early in the morning. Please be generous to them and keep everything spotless. And also, many of you signed this sheet, but if you didn't and would like to, I'll just leave it here for a while after the talk, and you can do that. So, Joan?
Do you want me to handle them?
Yeah, sure.
Question. The gentleman in the back.
Thank you very much for the lecture. In your recent Los Angeles Times interview, you made some interesting comments comparing the generous terms, leading in terms of surrender, then to some things we see in our own times in other countries that are far from generous. And I wonder if there's more you want to say about that. That's about maybe what some of the lessons are for.
Well, my forthcoming book on surrender is not going to be a comparative work, but I've become very interested in other wars and the ending of other wars. We're going through the 100th anniversary of the World War I. It's always some anniversary of some war because wars are all over. But I became interested in the Versailles Peace Agreement, for example, and how harsh that was compared to the ending of World War II, in which the United States Marshall Plan was an example of, I think most people say it was a generous reconstruction plan, and how wars end is very, very important. And in addition to that, civil wars, many civil wars in history and the ones that are occurring now seem to go on. And you know, my older son lives in Eastern Europe, and everyone hates each other, dating back from medieval times. And it's really quite distressing. You can't, so I think that's what I was referring to. Although Pat Morrison might have made some things up. Question?
So I was curious, on the Palm Sunday imagery, since Lincoln is shot around, I guess, Good Friday, do you see similarities? Are there Good Friday or Easter images on Lincoln's assassination?
Oh, I mean, it was very much together. I mean, Lincoln, the sermons on Easter Sunday, the day after Lincoln died, it was the apotheosis of Lincoln, and he became a Christ-like figure in the North, not in the South. But it was very heavy with Christian symbolism. Absolutely. Question?
Grant has been criticized for the level of casualties that his troops suffered. Do you think there's any validity to those criticisms?
Well, the question is, Grant has been, you can say it, he's been called a butcher. And that's because, especially in the last year of the war, there were huge casualties as he and Lee fought it out, as I said, over the countryside of Virginia. I think that he made a decision, and Lee made a decision, and their presidents made a decision to throw everything they had into the war. The United States had not won the war in the 3 years previous to Grant assuming command, and the issue, I think, was that the previous generals that led the campaigns in the Eastern Theater would fight these gigantic battles, but it would result in a stalemate. And both armies, the Confederate armies and the Union armies, would go back to their camps, and then they would fight another day. And how long was this going to go on? When Grant took over, he said, I propose to fight it out on this line. If it takes all summer and fall and winter, whatever it takes, I'm here. I'm here to the end of the war. And I think that you could say that did result in a lot of casualties, and he was criticized for it. I mean, people were sickened by it. They also should realize, however, that Robert E. Lee, if you care about such things and you study the rates of casualties in his armies, he had a much higher casualty rate than Grant. Grant's was relatively low in the West, very high when he faced Lee. Lee had suffered a much greater. If you wanted to fight and die for the Confederacy, you joined the Army of Northern Virginia. And so you could say both generals were butchers, but isn't that the job of a general during the war, during these wars? It's hard to assess that.
With the surrender of Fort Donelson, I've always been curious, was there any accounting made about the actual public response to those loyalty requirements?
The question is a great one. It's about after surrenders took place at Donelson and Vicksburg, and certainly, but during the war, when the Union Army would occupy great swaths of the South, was there any problems with taking loyalty oaths? Because white Southerners who were in these places could start their businesses again. They could go to church again. They could start their lives up again, but they had to swear their loyalty to the United States of America. There's someone in the room who's an expert in this, a graduate student of mine, Ellie Harville, who's working on civilians in Missouri, which was a little bit out of the major theaters of war, but had these issues. Yes, there were problems. If you took a loyalty oath, you crossed your fingers in the back. I swear my loyalty to the United States. Some wouldn't take loyalty oaths, and attacked those who did. But it was. I mean, that was what I was alluding to when I briefly talked about the difficulties of Reconstruction that were, as the war went on, became greater and greater. Also, how do you, under Union occupation, let's say in Mississippi and Tennessee, how does a Union Army, a Union commander like Grant, impose the military rule over white and black people who the black people are now contrabands. The black men are being enrolled in the Union Army. What are their positions? What are they going to do? Each of them going to do? The immensity of the questions in this war just still astonished me.
Well, as you mentioned, we always think of Appomattox as being the end of the Civil War, but it seems as if we dodged a bullet, that there may have been an opportunity for ongoing guerrilla war and not, without end. Can you make any comment on that, and how did that?
The question is that very colorfully put, that we dodged a bullet by not having large-scale guerrilla uprisings. There was violence in Reconstruction, as I'm sure you know, but Lee was urged by one of his top generals, Porter Alexander, to go and just go into the countryside and fight as long as you possibly could. But Lee he didn't have that DNA. He didn't believe that guerrilla warfare was right, that it would be terribly destructive to his people, as he would call them. He wouldn't do it. And the surrenders that took place after Appomattox, because there were several armies still out in the field, the biggest one being Joe Johnston's in North Carolina. Joe Johnston surrendered to William Sherman, but all these surrenders were conducted using Grant's terms, and every army had to surrender individually because Lincoln never acknowledged that the Confederacy was a nation. So every army had to, and he meant, even though there were things about the war that indicated that we were treating the Confederates as a nation, it had to work that way. But Lincoln believed that for purposes of Reconstruction, which he wanted to control as much as he could, that this would be the way to go. It would make it easier to welcome rebellious states back in and not treat them like a country.
Did Robert E. Lee ever write his own thoughts and feelings about April 9th?
Robert E. Lee did not really, he should have, it would have been great if we had his memoirs next to Grant's memoirs. He didn't live very long after the Civil War. He didn't really write anything very descriptive of Appomattox. He did give interviews, and the interviews were later put into print. We're not sure if they're true or not. But he wasn't a great writer, and he didn't live that long in any case. There's somebody up there.
Is there something uniquely American about Grant's magnanimity? One doesn't think of much grace when you think about the European powers and their wars at that time.
I actually think there's, that's a good question, but I think that many wars in history have embedded gestures of magnanimity and mercy in them. I can't give you the examples, but it's not uncommon. And I think that because the United States wanted the country to reunite, it was going to, the only way that was going to happen if they had generous treatment. And all throughout the war, Lincoln made clear he spoke to the Southerners. He said, come back. Until 1863, January 1st, 1863, he offered all kinds of I guess you could say, inducements to the Confederate States to give up their slaves. He said, I'll reimburse you for your slaves, because if we do that, that would be much less expensive than waging this war, which was incredibly expensive.
So Grant's memoirs were written when he's dying 20 years later, but did he make any contemporaneous record of the events at Appomattox?
This was the most written up war in history to date. There are about, yes, he did. I have on my library shelf at home, which several people in this room know about, I have 31 volumes of the papers of U.S. Grant. And they were published as part of a centennial movement to gather his scattered papers all over the country. And he had lots to say about it. All of his military correspondence is printed and easy to find, and the letters he wrote to his wife and to his family. It's an amazing source. Mark.
It seemed like part of Grant's maturation process as a leader, and as you talked about, is that he kind of gathered more of a respect for human life and a desire to avoid the effusion of blood if it was futile. So as the strategic picture in late 1864 and 65 takes shape, and it looks like the end of the war is at hand and that the Army of Northern Virginia is in a precarious position, did he ever talk about overtly being frustrated that it wouldn't just be done and that they were going to have to continue to clash and butt heads? Did he ever write or speak to anyone about this as absurd that we're still fighting?
He did, and the question is, in the last months of the war, it was a tense time because it could go on. It could go on for, Grant was worried that Lee would somehow escape because it seemed that he could almost do anything. He had so gotten into the minds of the men of the Army of the Potomac, it was really hard for Grant to change that culture, and in fact, he never did. But that's why he had the migraines. That's why he couldn't eat. He just he just wanted to get to the end of this war. And you read the correspondence between Grant and Stanton and Grant and Lincoln. Lincoln is also feeling the same way. They knew the war was going to end, but when and how, and it had to end the right way. And it's great. It's a great correspondence that reveals the anxiety, the concern. It's also interesting to read the correspondence between Jefferson Davis and members of his cabinet, and Davis and Lee, when Lee wrote the letter saying, I surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia. And Jefferson Davis, he's a very interesting person. He didn't accept that. He was ready to go into the countryside and fight to the very end, at least he said he was. He didn't want Joe Johnston to surrender, and by that time, his cabinet members And his general, Joe Johnston, in the field said, you know, we're not listening to you, you're crazy. I don't know if they said it like that. Okay. Okay.
I just had a question. You compared the end of the Second World War and the Reconstruction in Germany a little bit, and the magnanimity there to the end of this war. But of course, Franklin Roosevelt adopted the unconditional surrender policy that Grant, was famous for using once and then, as you said, not applying really again.
Although everyone says that he's always unconditional surrender Grant.
Yeah, exactly. And I wonder, looking at the results of Reconstruction, after the Second World War and the results of Reconstruction, or the failed results of Reconstruction at the end of the Civil War, do you ever think about the possibility that we might have been better served if he had stuck to the unconditional surrender line more, at least symbolically, in
Well,
terms of resistance?
the question is a great one, and you are assuming that Reconstruction was a failure. Now, it is a failure to us because justice was not served to the freed African Americans. It was, in that way, it was a failure, and it would await a second civil rights revolution. The seeds were planted here in the first one. But the thing that I can tell you is that most Americans thought it was a success. They thought it was a success because the Union stayed together, and that was a lot of people in the North. They thought that was the biggest, most important issue. The Union stayed together. The United States remained as one country, and we often wonder or speculate what would our country's history be like had the Confederacy successfully established their independence. There are many scenarios to be played out, but I can tell you one thing: it wouldn't have been good for African Americans, and it possibly wouldn't be good for world history. I don't know. There you go.
General Sherman, a few months prior to this, had credited with the concept of total war in the March to the Sea, a very punitive burning of plantations to try to destroy civilian morale. He was very close to Grant. Here we are a few months later. Were these liberal terms, was that an antidote to that, or did they have a fundamentally different outlook on how to...
Well, Sherman, it's a very fascinating story, and this gentleman is referring to Sherman. Sherman actually negotiated 2 surrenders with the Confederate Army in North Carolina. One out of some kind of idea that he and Johnston could actually set up the Confederate, not the Confederate, Southern state governments again. The first surrender was absolutely unacceptable, and it caused a lot of headaches for Sherman. He didn't tell anybody about it. He thought he was doing what Lincoln wanted. He didn't follow Grant's surrender terms, even though he was told to. And the point is that that after Lincoln's assassination, the idea that Sherman was basically allowing the state governments to start operating again, elections to be held without consulting Washington, D.C., just brought the wrath of God and Edwin Stanton on his head. And as soon as Sherman sent, it's very interesting, I think it was it was April 18th, when Sherman and Johnston signed the surrender agreement. He sent it by telegraph to Washington, D.C. Grant read it, and he said, "Oh my God." And he immediately took it to a cabinet meeting, and Andrew Johnson and Edwin Stanton, and they just were in a rage. And Grant said, just let me take care of this. And he immediately left Washington, D.C., went down to North Carolina, and Sherman had no idea what was happening, and the newspapers were attacking him. Here was a great hero of the Civil War being vilified in the Northern press as somebody who committed treason. And Grant said, "Look, let's sit down. Here's what I said. Write it out, get it signed," and then it was done. And Stanton, Sherman never forgave Stanton. Hated him. And the answer, the Sherman always said, "Well, I was just doing what Lincoln told me to do on the River Queen." but that's not true. He just lost his head.
One more.
As the people of Georgia would agree with.
You referenced Bruce Catton a couple of times.
Yes.
Are there any particular authors you might recommend or that you like besides Catton?
Oh, yes.
I mean, some particular.
Let's see, do you have another hour? About the war? You mean just the war in general?
Just like in general, but other authors you consider.
Well, I have to say, one of the first books I read when I realized that I was going to become a Civil War historian was the work of James McPherson. He has a magnificent textbook, Battle Cry of Freedom. There are many books on Lincoln that I really like, almost too numerous to mention. I think my favorite biography is by somebody who works out of the Huntington Library, Ronald White, published a nice biography of Lincoln. And it's just, there's a lot of great work, both classic like Bruce Catton and new work that's coming out on the home front, on women in the Civil War. It's just a spectacular explosion. Thank you.